There are many errors I've seen over the years when it comes to muting the horn, so let this video serve as a definitive guide to muting the instrument. Please send this to all composers and compositional students as we can finally get on the same page and eliminate the confusion. I'll be going into a deep dive in horn muting history as well to try to find an answer to some oddities, so let's dive in. First, let's just answer the question for today. The horn can be played in one of three ways: open, muted, or stopped. That's it. I'll dive into more about this video, but the short answer is that. If you've written or seen anything else, it's wrong and potentially causes some confusion. So let's dive in, starting with the history. Back in the 1700s, horn players started experimenting with putting things in their bell to alter the sound. This is where the hand horn technique began, and we attribute this to Anton Hampel, but that is more so because he and his star pupil Giovanni Punto were the ones to popularize and codify it, not because they were the first. From my understanding, the idea of placing other objects in your bell for a different sound as a common thing came in later after the valves were implemented and popularized sometime around 1849. Yes, the valve was invented in the 18-teens, but composers and horn players didn't exactly want to adopt it until after Schumann's Adagio and Allegro and Concertstück from early 1849. There is a marking for con sordino at the end of Beethoven's 6, so while I'm saying it was a commonplace for after the 1850s, we know it existed at least back to 1808. Now we come into where orchestration books that mention muting, and I'm going to be using terms in multiple languages, and since I'm only fluent in English, my pronunciation will either be a strong American accent or with an Americanized pronunciation. So, con sordino, mette sordina, or mit dampfe have all been translated to mean stopped horn by Rimsky-Korsakov and Charles Marie Widor. Widor even gives an example of this, but I have no idea what piece he's referring to, almost as if he was pretty sure that's what it meant and couldn't find an example, so he made one up. He credits other examples here too, which is odd. Also, if this meant the same thing, then when Respighi wrote Chiuso and then later Sordino, should we be playing them the same? And if so, with mute or stopped? Maybe it doesn't matter. But of course, this train of thought, too, is why we get stuff like this from Bartók. We can't do muted and stopped, it's one or the other. The problem is that since Korsakov said that they are interchangeable and sound the same, which is widely untrue, at least today, we have no idea what was originally meant. I did receive a comment on my Adler orchestration video that did say this might be a translation error. Whether this is true or not, it still contributed to the problem. Cuivre has also been translated to mean stopped by Cecil Forsyth and Widor, but it means brassy or just a brighter sound. Widor also uses the term overblown, which let's just go with makes no sense. But in short, since stopped horn requires closing off the bell with your hand and that's it, in what way are we overblowing? Anyway, a perfect example of explaining cuivre is here in the Sorcerer's Apprentice, where it's marked boucher and cuivre. If they meant the same thing, why would Dukas write both here? So let's get these terms straight. Muted, con sordino, mette sordina, and mit dampfe all mean the same thing, play with mute. Stopped, chiuso, gestopped, and boucher all mean stopped horn. But film composers today give us some other muting options, so let's talk about those. These composers do write consort or mute, and they also place a plus sign over stop passages as well, which aids in this weirdness. But what horn players do is treat the brass and metal mutes as stopped markings, and the wood and fiber mutes as just regular mute passages. We are assuming this unless we can easily hear it on the soundtrack, so if you are publishing your music and want a specific sound and don't want to run into the confusion, use open, mute, or stopped. In my video talking about Samuel Adler's orchestration book, there was mention of transposing and non-transposing mutes. Given the information so far in this video alone, noting that I've provided examples of each, which of these mutes is transposing and which one is non-transposing? Nothing in this video so far provides you with enough evidence as to which is which. And that is part of the reason why I have a problem with this terminology. The stop mute is the transposing mute because when inserted into the bell, it decreases the length of the horn by about 6 inches, thus transposing the horn up a half step. With that knowledge, it sounds like this will enable you to play in G flat or F sharp horn parts, but I challenge anybody watching this to name a piece that has that key of the horn. It actually does exist. Now, I theorize that the idea behind calling them transposing and non-transposing might have stemmed from the Rimsky-Korsakov idea about horn muting. But if this is the case, then I go back to wondering why we need a mute that puts us into G flat. There is one circumstance that does warrant calling something a non-transposing mute, and that is the non-transposing stop mute. This one case, it not only makes sense, but is required to understand what this does. It is a stop mute, but it doesn't transpose your instrument. You have to know that information to understand what this mute does. In that same video about Adler's orchestration book, I mentioned that there are wood stops and metal stops, and I'll explain the difference here. But note the choice to use one is up to the horn player, and the composers that request one over the other is going to be ignored. Hand stopping every passage can become tiresome, which is why stop mutes are used. This isn't always possible, so horn players will still need to know how to hand stop, but using a stop mute aids in a few ways. The metal stop mute is great for projection, but ends up having a tinnier sound compared to hand stopping. Ideal places for the metal stop would be in something like the second movement to Mahler 1. A wood stop has a sound closer to hand stopping, being a little bit warmer compared to the metal stop, so passages like the beginning of Mahler 9 would benefit from a wood stop. Dukas wrote for echo horn in both The Sorcerer's Apprentice and the horn solo piece Villanelle. As far as I'm aware, no one performs these as true echo horn. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is done both muted and stopped, and Villanelle is usually done stopped. True echo horn is not quite completely closing off the bell, so the pitch of the instrument actually goes down a half step rather than up. I believe in some teachings of hand horn technique this is listed as 3/4 stop. This provides a different sound than stopped horn. I wouldn't recommend writing for it. Composers have honestly made things far more confusing and difficult than they needed to be. I'm all for progression and adding in new ways to play, but these markings for stopped and muted or fiber and wood mutes need to go. Open, muted, stopped. Those are your options.